paddle wheels of the Whanganui River.
Yeah. We haven't got a photo of all three of us taken with them.
But it's a long time since you wrote the book with Uncle David.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and you've done a lot through your life too. Getting around and making verses and writing verses and other stuff.
I've lived in the UK and...
Just memories, aren't they?
Oh,
a lot of it's memories. And
exactly.
Yeah.
One day in January 1963, I boarded the diesel riverboat Wairua at Wanganui, one of about 40 passengers bound for a day's outing to Hippongo Park, some 16 miles upriver. Everyone was in a happy mood with that suppressed excitement engendered by a trip on a boat. But for me it was more than just a trip on a boat, for it was on this same stretch of water half a century before that I'd stood at the engine controls of a large stern-wheeled paddle steamer bound also for Hippongo Park, with 400 pleasure seekers swarming over her decks. These vessels were the lifeline of the pioneer farms and Maori settlements of the River Valley, besides being a vital link in the booming Auckland to Wellington tourist system. The spectacular and often hair-raising 3-day journey downriver between overhanging bush-topped bluffs and along quiet willow-lined reaches was, for thousands of tourists from all parts of the world, the highlight of their visit. I consider my 7-year span of service in the riverboats to be the most interesting period of my career, and the events of the time are clearly impressed on my mind. If only we could provide the thrills and scenic excitements of that trip today.
Single up. You go, Bill. Dead slow, Stan. We go, Stan. Slow ahead. Full ahead.
This boat was built by Wairua and Company, which are a specialist boat builder. And they had 2 yards, one in the Isle of Dogs in Poplar, London, and another yard in Glasgow. Today, when you build a boat, you might build the hull, but the engines, fittings, they're all built by outsourcers and contractors. The actual engines in this were built by Wairua and Company as well. Everything on the vessel, so they're very, very clever engineers. These are specialist craft that were designed specifically for shallow water navigation up a river, exactly like the Wanganui. She draws 22 inches because she's an old boat, but that's about 600 mil, which is very shallow draft for a vessel that weighs close to 80 tonne with a full capacity load on. Ordinary steel vessels of that size would easily draw 2 metres rather than 0.6 to 1 metre, so she's quite a unique design. we didn't really have the resources or the infrastructure to do it at the time, and that was back in the colonial days. A lot of stuff was still sourced back from England, and Yarrow and Company were, again, I think they were quite specialist. What they do is they build this in the yard and they assemble it, put it together, but not rivet her up completely, but assemble it to make sure they had everything correct and operational. Then they dismantle it, everything was labelled, numbered, dismantled, packed into crates and sent ready for shipping. And she came out here in 64 crates, and she was shipped, I'd imagine, as hold cargo in a larger steamer, an ocean-going steamer. Would have arrived in one of the main ports like Wellington, then come up on coastal steamer, and eventually was brought upriver to where she was assembled at the Hatrick's foundry, which is just opposite our current wharf. And I think she was assembled in about 7 weeks, which is quite remarkable. And then, like putting together a giant Meccano or a jigsaw puzzle, and then she was side-slipped into the river, and away she went. And she's been here ever since, even spending 40-odd years sunk in the river. I admire when you read some of the history of a vessel like this. This would have been, they would have roared through this on a daily basis, not even think about it. We're just playing really in the bottom reaches. They would have worked extremely hard to actually wrestle this laden with cargo up through the rapids, and it would be hazardous and extremely difficult. But they were hard-working men, and it was commerce. They would get the boat through, literally come hell or high water, because that was what you had to do to survive. Then again, I think people were a lot hardier. You see photos of passengers, well-dressed people, waiting to leave upriver to come back town, and they're dressed in their finery, and they've scrambled down a bank, and they're waiting in the mud for the boat to nose its way into the mud, and they'll scramble on board. And again, it would be hard to get people to accept that these days, but yeah, they were pioneering spirit.
I drifted into Whanganui in 1912, a lad of 22 with a Scottish accent, a propelled vessel rather than a steam engineer's ticket, and not much else. The situation's vacant columns made depressing reading, and the prospect of finding work were not good, but I did manage to maintain visible means of support temporarily by getting casual work with a gang engaged in demolishing a brick building, church I think, in Victoria Avenue, the town's main street. When work ended in the afternoon, I took a stroll to the lower end of the avenue, crossed Taupo Quay, and passed beneath the wrought iron archway that ornamented the entrance to Town Bridge, and for the first time I saw the Whanganui River. A few yards along Taupo Quay, upstream from the bridge and backing onto the river, I found a boarding house displaying the name River View House. I booked in. That night, when the evening meal was over, I learned of the existence of a well-organised river shipping service operating from its own wharves and large enough to warrant its own slipways and repair shops. I was immediately interested, as mention of boats has always affected me that way, possibly as a result of childhood on the Isle of Arran, where my father had a small boat hire business and my brother and I were his best, though least profitable customers. The firm was known as A. Hatrick and Co. Limited. I rose early next morning, crossed the bridge and walked up the east bank, and perhaps half a mile above the bridge I came to the company's repair yards. My inquiry was made at an opportune time, for one of the steamers was shortly due in for its annual overhaul, and an extra man could be used. I was given a job, again of a temporary nature, but this time work to my liking. The workshop I found was commonly known as the Foundry, For what reason I was never able to discover. It was a versatile establishment, equipped for such work as boiler making, fitting, turning, welding, smithing and carpentry, but not as a foundry. The foundry was in the charge of Mr. Billy Coates, the man responsible for keeping the fleet in good repair. Not an entirely enviable position, as I was to realise when I grew to know something of the rugged and far-flung conditions in which the boats worked. One of the standing amusements of the foundry was Mr. Coates's aversion to using the old wall-type telephone, which, in spite of his mechanical background, he still seemed to regard as being in the new-fangled invention stage. I continued living at the Riverview, as it was comfortable and handy to the foundry. Immediately below Town Bridge were the Whanganui wharves, busy with coastal steamers and deep-sea sailing vessels, whose cargoes created incessant activity to and from the long cargo sheds and the railway wagons and horse-drawn transport that cluttered the dockside.
If you go to the end of the tidal reach, that's actually the navigational limit of where we'll take this vessel. She used to, of course, battle away up through the rapids, upriver, but she's too old and precious to bother playing with that these days. Although sometimes I think it'd be challenging to do it. The stretch of the river we're operating in now is there's no problem with depth navigability. I've got 3-4 metres of water underneath me. When you get to the end of the tidal reach, which is about 24 mile upriver, the river starts to climb up into its catchment basin. And this vessel used to travel 60 mile up through that catchment area. She went through some 44 rapids to get to her final destination, and she did that on a daily basis. Some of that water is challenging for a jet boat these days. But this vessel was designed for that, and she copes with it, and that's what she was specifically built for. She does a remarkably good job of it. Anything you can think of that would have been used to break in this country in the 1900s. Passengers, cargo, mail. It was what we call a king country now, which is a really rich farming area. Was incredibly harsh terrain covered in native bush, but it's very fertile country. It was broken in off this river, and so all of the materials that went in to develop the infrastructure, to open up the country, to establish farms, and then once they became viable, to bring all of your produce back downstream. So yeah, it was all of the people, all of the freight, everything involved. If you imagine everything that runs up and down the highway now in a truck and trailer or a bus, it was all done off these vessels.
We have you either up on the top deck or in port or rear saloon. We need the decks cleared so we can tie up. Thank you.
I really fancy swimming all the way back down there.
Alexander Hatrick was a classic example of the country's hard-bitten, go-ahead pioneers of commerce. No shrinking violet, he was a big man with a big moustache and, when the occasion warranted it, a big voice. He had the reputation of being a hard man, but a straight one. Hatrick had arrived in Wanganui from Australia in 1875, 10 years after the end of how-how activity along the river, and about 5 years later went into business with another man as Walker and Hatrick, traders and merchants. A few years later, Hatrick assumed full control, and the title was changed to A. Hatrick & Co. Limited, and the business thrived as more and more settlers arrived to push out into the now peaceful regions beyond the town. Alexander Hatrick, as well as becoming a power in the commercial life of Whanganui, made an impact in civic and other quarters, notably as the town's mayor and a member of the Harbour Board. Alexander Hatrick, seeing possibilities in an upriver service, ordered a flat-bottomed side paddle steamer from Yarrows of Poplar, London. When completed, the vessel was shipped to Wanganui in sections, assembled and named Wai-iti. Her successful inaugural trip to Pipiriki, made on the 21st of December 1891, aroused tremendous interest. One can imagine the excitement of those aboard as their ship mastered one by one the 44 rapids on the route, and the excitement of the riverside Maori as the ship passed their lonely kaingas.
The Maoris, they lived beside it. It was like their highway. See it as a living thing. They want to protect it. It's sort of like their home, and they use it for source of food. And it's like you have rules that you sort of respect. The Maoris are basically almost born in a canoe. The canoe to the Maori was like a car is to us nowadays. They were basically natural canoeists. They understood all the currents and how to read water. The Maoris have got a saying, I am the river and the river is me. And that's how I feel as well. I went up there when I was very young, going to school. And it just sort of gets hold of you somehow. We used to go from Pipiriki down, and then we used to get a session in the library, and I was just looking through books to read, and the Paddlewheels book caught my eye, and I thought, oh, that looks interesting. I've been in the river, and I see what this book's about. So then I started reading it, and as I got into it, I just kept reading it, and then I couldn't put the bloody thing down. It was their sense of humour and the excitement of the boats. I'd been for a ride on the Wanganui a few years earlier, and really loved that. That was just around the town bridge, when the town bridge was opened, early 70s, I think. Dad said, go up on the bridge, you might get to go driving the boat. So I went up on the bridge, and Dave Upchurch, he was driving it, and he said, hey mate, do you want to have a go at driving? I said, oh yeah, I'd love to. So I had to go on the wheel. It was a big deal for a small kid at school.
Service had come to the river, with the firm's head offices occupying an imposing block in Taupo Quay, opposite the main wharves below the bridge. I asked one of the engineers what he thought of my chances of getting a job afloat. Well, I don't know about an engineer's job, he said. Nothing doing there that I know of, but I hear a fireman on one of the upriver boats is leaving, so why not go and see Hatrick? Why not, indeed? I walked down there and presented myself to the man himself. I got the firing job, with brusque instructions to travel next morning as a passenger to Pipiriki, and once there to join the Wairua. Navigation of the boats was never plain sailing, as considerable and continuous work was involved in keeping the channels free of obstructions, a responsibility carried out by the River Trust Board, the body set up to administer the area's scenic and tourist potential. They blasted obstructions, removed snags, and diverted the flow where it showed signs of spreading into shallows or building up with shingles, silt and debris. A trip to Taumarunui, I was assured, meant more than boarding a boat in Whanganui and stepping ashore 144 smooth and carefree miles upriver. In its total journey of nearly 200 miles, it was joined by innumerable tributaries, several of them rivers in their own right. Collectively, these caused its level to fluctuate sharply and often, sometimes by inches, sometimes by many feet in a few short hours. This system was dictated by the volume of water in each section, the flow naturally increasing in its progress down through its catchment of nearly 3,000 square miles of largely hilly bush country. The fleet at the time of my arrival numbered 12 vessels, comprising 1 stern paddle steamer, 2 side paddle steamers, 2 twin-screw steamers, 3 medium-sized single-screw steamers, and 4 kerosene-powered motorboats of approximately 60 feet in length. The journey, in fact, was divided into 3 separate sections: Whanganui to Pipiriki, Pipiriki to Houseboat, and Houseboat to Taumarunui. Each section operated semi-independently with its own boats and crews, and each section, I was doubly assured, possessed its quota of difficulties. The lower 55-mile section was covered by the paddle steamers and the larger vessels of the fleet. On the 59-mile middle leg were the vessels of medium size, and on the final 30-mile run to Taumarunui were the smaller boats of the Wairua type. In addition, a large Tortora Maori canoe fitted with an inboard motor was kept at Taumarunui. On our left appeared the bush-covered hills of Hipango Park, long established as a public reserve and favourite getaway spot. Shortly after passing the park, I detected a mild turbulence in the hitherto sluggish water, a turbulence that increased as we proceeded. The increasing speed of the current seemed to incite a vague stirring inside me, and a faint feeling of anticipation replaced the leisure and calm of before. We rounded a bend, and I saw my first white water. There's something indescribable in the roar of a rapid, and the sound has never failed to stir me, as though perhaps the voice of the river was sending out a warning to any who might underestimate it. The Wai-iti thrust her nose into the tumbling water and seemed to hesitate. like an eel inspecting a tempting bait. I realized I was holding my breath. This was something beyond me. In my experience, ships sailed in water. The deeper the better. Anything suggesting obstruction was to be avoided like dynamite. And here was a ship about to propel itself through a few inches of foam that roared aloud a message of barely hidden dangers, and uphill at that. It seemed to me to be against the laws of common sense, gravity, and most certainly navigation. I took a look at those about me, and several apparently new chums like myself, or perhaps just old hands feeling a bit seedy after the rigours of town life, looked exactly as I felt, tense and slightly apprehensive. The Wai-iti edged forward, up into the froth. Looking at the water rushing past, it was easy to gain the impression we were doing a mighty rate of knots, but a glance at the tumble of boulders a few short feet away showed the true picture. We were barely making headway. Suddenly the rough water was gone. We were out of the rapid and churning into the reach above. It was something like gaining a wide, flat roof after climbing a high and shaky ladder. Within minutes we entered another rapid, and this time I found myself facing the event with considerably less trepidation, though still keeping a wary eye on progress. The river dog-legged back and forth through literally every point of the compass. The ever-changing position of the sun testified to this, so it was difficult to believe we were really heading in a northerly direction. All around was the native bush, still with that almost visual silence of lonely places, which the call of the tui and the pigeon only accentuates. We seemed to have been battling the river for hours and hours, and it was not without a degree of pleasure that I sighted the buildings of a village on the right bank in a quiet section of the river. Other villages came and went, Koriniti, Matahiwi, both on the right bank, the latter lending its name to another mighty rapid, which, like the Ahu, had also been thoughtfully equipped with a built-in cable. At Ranana we were about 45 miles from Wanganui as the eel swims, and here the river was divided by an island, which was famous in early history as the scene of a battle which turned the tide of Hauhauism as it rampaged down the river with the small, vulnerable settlement of Wanganui as the objective.
o te hei mauriora. Ko rua pehi te maunga, ko Aotea te waka, ko ruaka te marae, ko te morihi te wharenui. E ngā manuhiri tuarangi, nau mai, hara mai, ki te marae nei o Ngāti Ruaka. Kei ngā puke kōrero te tū nei, tū mai, tū mai, tū mai. Tū mai rā, hei tohu i te orangatanga o ngā mātua tūpuna. Ko moi te pō, haere, haere, haere tū rā. E ngā mate, haere, haere, haere. Haere ki te pō nui, te pō roa, te pō tongo tongo, haere e moi. E ngā manuhiri, nau mai, hara mai ki te marae nei, Ngāti Ruaka. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Whakarongo ki te tangi o te manu hei e karanga ki a piri tātou haere atu rā ko ngā tanga tapu ko te mea nui ko te aroha ko te mea nui ko te aroha.
Once again, I would like to welcome you all again to our marae. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Okay, I'd like to thank you very much for your welcome. It's been a bit of a long time since I've managed to get up here, but it's good to be here.
Kia ora.
And thanks very much for the welcome.
Well, have a haruru now, just a formal hello and welcome, just a press on notices as we get started on the men, they'll come around.
Te Wairua tapu
Amini. E kai.
Yourself.
Just love it. It's so different. All the scenery, different scenery, and seeing the mill and different places, and even the animals up on the hill. Yeah, and the rapids.
I just thought it'd be quite interesting. Something I have never done before, like in New Zealand, a trip like that.
On the morning of the 14th of May 1864, a party of friendly Maori from the lower river powers, by whatever powers of strategy, induced the hauhau to retire to the island and there engage in a nice, tidy Maori against Maori battle, even conceding first shot to their guests. Once the niceties had been observed, a fierce battle raged, the baddies eventually being driven to the river to make a scattered retreat along the hostile banks. The Pai Marini, as the bloody hauhau faith was originally called, meaning incongruously goodness and grace, never succeeded in their downriver quest. After more than a year of further heavy fighting in the area surrounding Pipiriki, the then leader, Pehi Turoa, laid down his musket. The name of the island is Motua, and in tribute to those Maori who died there, Motua Gardens, adjacent to the Hatrick Wharf in Wanganui, were established as a memorial. We took the channel to the left of the island, cable hauling up a rapid taking its name. Wairua, the hardest rapid of the trip, according to Captain Stewart, loomed ahead. The cable was picked up only after a long search. It had fouled on a snag to one side of the river. Progress was so hard won, and the cable so taut, I thought it wise to move back out of range behind the funnel. A couple of reaches above this, there came into view the most picturesque village of the trip, Jerusalem. Situated on rising ground at a point where the river swung left, it appeared directly ahead as we advanced up the reach below. Its most striking feature was the tall, white steeple of the mission chapel, looking down protectively over the meeting house, cottages and whares that comprised the village. In contrast to some of the places we'd passed, the buildings appeared well painted and proudly cared for. This famed mission station had been founded in 1884 by Mother Mary Joseph Aubert. Among its functions were the education and care of orphaned and destitute children from the riverside paths, and care of the aged and infirm. Beyond Jerusalem, half a dozen miles of smooth water interspersed with as many small, quiet rapids, which I thought rather a tame climax, brought us to the wharves of Pipiriki on the right bank. The time was 5 p.m., with 55 miles, 42 rapids, and a lift of 100 feet behind her. The Wai-iti was right on schedule. Tied up there, I noticed, was my ship, the Wairua. Pipiriki, in relation to the villages I'd seen during the day, befitted its status as home port for the vessels of the middle run and stopover place for the tourists. It was, in a bush-bound way, almost a metropolis. Set well above flood level, its most imposing building was the tourist hotel Pipiriki House, its long, white-balconied bulk far overshadowing any of its neighbours. The two gable ends that faced the river were finished in a battened effect that gave the building a Tudor-like appearance. At the direction of Captain Stewart, I followed up the rough road that ascended the scrub-covered hill in a long, two-legged zigzag. We turned up a side track from the main artery and entered the second most important building on the skyline, the Hatrick-owned store-cum-post office, a single-storey weatherboard structure with a veranda right across the front. I made myself known to the manager, and he issued me with blankets and directed me to temporary accommodation in an old house, one I'd seen on the roadside near the top of the hill. The house was comfortable enough, but had apparently been temporary accommodation for some time, and it lacked the cared-for look a permanent tenant might have bestowed on it. Pipiriki House, though originally established by independent owners, was acquired by Hatricks in 1899, although in 1909 it was destroyed by fire and rebuilt as one of the most up-to-date tourist hotels in New Zealand. The dining room was comfortably furnished and the meal of a high standard, served by the steward of the Wairua. It was late when I dragged myself from the companionable atmosphere of the dining room and found my way back to my chilly boudoir. Next morning, when I went in for breakfast, the dining room was almost deserted, most of the men apparently taking advantage of the opportunity to sleep in. I was puzzled by the attitude of the few Maoris I encountered. Whereas on the previous evening I had been treated with a sort of shy friendliness, now there seemed to be a tendency to avert contact with me, even to avoid looking me in the eye. Having full confidence in the brand of soap I used, I grew more and more baffled, until I was enlightened by one of the more knowledgeable residents. I had slept, he told me, in the haunted house. For some time before there had been a drowning accident in the river. The schoolmaster and his two sons were swimming near the wharf when one of the boys got into difficulties. The other boy, trying to save him, also found himself in trouble, and the father tried vainly to save his sons. All three were drowned. Anyway, having familiarised myself with the village, I walked down to the wharf to give my ship, the Wairua, a once-over and meet the engineer, George Wai-iti. After showing me over the job, George, a tall, friendly chap with a dry sense of humour, told me to be aboard by 4 o'clock the next morning to raise steam. Dressing by the light of a candle, I was on board promptly at 4 a.m. to begin my life as a riverboat man. George Wai-iti was already on hand to familiarise the new boy with the vessel's idiosyncrasies and to warm through the engine and generally make ready for the long grind ahead. Shortly before departure time, Captain Joe Tarry and the other crew members came yawning aboard, and at 5 a.m. the lines were cast off, and we commenced our 59-mile journey to the Houseboat, upper terminal of the Middle Run. Within minutes, as if to jolt me out of any misconception that I'd embarked on a life of easy living, we tackled Paparoa Rapid. This was actually a double rapid, situated on a bend and one of the swiftest on the river. On this occasion, my first trip, the water happened to be exceptionally low, but it was still a hard pull with the cable, first up the lower rapid and almost immediately into the next. The journey then became a more exacting and more tortuous repetition of the trip up to Pipiriki, the narrow bends, the snag-ridden reaches, and boulder-bound shallows necessitating almost constant action in all departments. Autapu, Aratira, and Ruahinitoro rapids fell astern, and we were now in the real bush country, a land of massive fern-shrouded bluffs and unbroken forests. The toughest, most notorious rapid on the whole river, I'd been warned, was Ngaporo, 6 or 7 miles above Pipiriki. The name had cropped up frequently in Pipiriki, usually in tones touched about the edges with awe. I was soon given a first-hand opportunity of studying its fearsomeness, as for one thing, Ngaporo itself was the upper of 3 strong rapids, coming one upon the other within a matter of chains, so that in effect the vessel was in a partly exhausted condition when it got to fight the main fight. We met trouble from the start, as the cable could not be found. It may have been snagged, it may have been buried under shingle. Whatever the cause, prolonged searching with the hook failed to find it. Again, experience had prepared us for such an emergency. Easing the vessel over the boulder bank on the right, Captain Tarry held her there in such a position that our 2 deckhands were able to jump ashore, dragging with them a spare coil of wire rope. Fortunately for me, this bit of fiddling about with the cable had given just enough respite to bring the steam pressure back from the embarrassing depths to which the lower rapids had dragged it. A nasty feature of Ngaporo was that towards the top, the bed fanned out to such width that in contrast to the narrow depths below, the water was but a few rippling inches deep, so that progress depended to a great degree on the cable. We made the reach with the steam almost down to ounces, and I gave thanks that the next rapid, though close to Ngaporo, was an easy one, with a longish reach above, so that by the time we engaged Reid at the mouth of the Whanganui and River, my department was nearly back to normal. It was about this time that in desperation I involved a method of firing by which it was possible to keep the needle somewhere near the red mark and the engine turning at its specified 450 RPM, except during a really prolonged pull. It must be understood that everything about the Wairua stokehold was on a small scale, except perhaps her appetite. The prime ingredient was speed. To leave the firebox door open only a few seconds too long turned the fire into a tricky, exasperating, unresponsive mess. As always, eager hands reached for the things we brought. The fertilizer, flour, meal, gel-ignite, and all the things essential to their living and the development of their raw land.
Wai-iti is situated 20 miles northwest of Ratahi, a settlement that was opened up in 1909. The settlers went in to chop bush and establish a farm. It was surveyed out, 14,260 something acres was allocated by the government for returned servicemen, mainly for returned servicemen, and private individuals. And in 1909, at the drill hall in Ratahi, people went there at a certain date and they put in an application. They already had a look at properties and they put in an application to buy these particular properties or lease them. Most of them wanted to lease them, but some of them had the money. They had the money to buy properties, but unfortunately a lot of farmers, they had no money. They had was their signature. They just signed up for the lease hopefully make some money to pay for the lease. But the government said, no, well, you don't need to pay anything for 5 years. They never signed the agreement for the right of purchase. That's where a lot of them fell down. The First World War, returned soldiers were coming back from overseas. 85% of the soldiers wanted to go farming. They were pushed out into bush in 1918. They were given an axe and told to get out there and chop some bush. A soldier that had been overseas fighting for the country. And they come back, and it's a pity some of those bloody politicians weren't put out there. And they pushed the soldiers back in the Mangapuru and Kaiwaka Uku and Mangatiti, and give it an axe and get out there and make a farm. 1927 I was born in Wairua in Hannibal. I was about 19 or 20, and I was young and fit and bloody strong. And I had about 3,000 posts split. We were packing them out. And then at that particular time, the government were trying to get enough posts to fence up these blocks for returned servicemen. Well, originally when Bob was there, and he got a bit sick of it, he thought, well, he'd like to get out and do a flat farm, you see, better country, a flat farm. So he saw me and he said, do you want to buy the farm? Well, I didn't have a bloody pound. I was just a backcountry kid, labourer, getting, working for a farmer, and you were nothing, you know, you were unknown. And I said to Bob, I said, well, what the hell am I going to buy it with? And Bob said, well, he said you got 2,000 posts split in the back in the bush. He said, if you get and pack those out and sell them, he said, there's £500 deposit. So we went to the agent. He said, you'll have no problem. To okay the loan, he said, I got to get a ring from Wanganui, which was head office. He was only a branch office. This phone went, and the agent went up and he put the receiver to his ear. And, oh, yes. Oh, is it? Yes, okay. Whether he's speaking to anyone on the other end, I don't know. Probably not. And then he put the receiver down, and they come across to old Dad, and he said, Ted, they won't lend it. But Bob, he didn't stomach that at all. Bob been with the bloody stockworm for years. He said, if that's the way they treat him, he said they can go to buggery. And my old dad said to Bob, he said, we'll get the money somehow, Bob. We'll get it somehow. All we want is £500 a deposit. And so we went straight down to Les Baird, the solicitor. So we went in and signed up for the farm, and we didn't have a bloody pound on us. Yeah, we had nothing at all. And we signed up to the bloody farm, and that only took 10 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes. And then we walked out of the office, and I remember old Bob saying to me, he said, you better get going and pack those posts out, Morris. And I said, yeah, I'll certainly do that. I think that some of them thought I was bloody mad going in to get the posts. Split the... Oh, he'd never do it. My brother said, he said, what the hell are you going in there for, splitting posts? He said, well, you won't make your salt. I still owed Bob another 1,000. I got the farm for 2,000. When they first come up and chopped the bush, and then there was a house on it. Bob he tried to sell the house, but just as well because I lived in the house, you see. Well, I bought all your children, and you were brought up in our house. Good house.
So the journey wore on, with not more than a few minutes at the bank's side here and there. The screw turned non-stop, as at most of these brief calls it was usual not to tie up, but to hold the vessel at an angle, nose into the bank, with the engine running. An occasional cup of tea and a cold snack turned on by the steward was a hurried affair, snatched between fires. As the miles gathered behind us and the coal dust caked on my sweaty body, I found myself less and less interested in the passing scene, and more interested in reaching our destination for a good wash down, a hot meal, and somewhere to lay my weary back. It had been some time since I'd wielded a shovel, and the lack of training showed. It was commonly said that the further one went up the Wanganui, the better the scenery became, but I couldn't have confirmed this, as sustained manual labour, blistered hands, and coal dust in the eyes have a dulling effect on the perceptions. On one upriver trip we stopped at Mangapurua, the landing for a newly settled block, to discharge half a ton of gelignite, a commodity much used in the clearing of the land. No one was there to take delivery of the consignment, so we stacked it on the bank, and the next day on the return trip we noticed the gelignite had been removed. On the next upriver trip the Mangapurua settlers were there to greet us. When were we going to bring up their blankety-blank jelly, they wanted to know. Much of the cultivated land upriver owes its present-day productivity to return servicemen from the First World War. These men, sent upriver to almost impossible country with the bare essentials, bore appalling hardship, toil, frustrations, and sometimes failure in clearing and working the land allotted to them by a duty-bound government. I recall dropping 2 such men in pouring rain at the foot of a papa bluff, in one of the most God-forsaken spots on the river. They had a tent, a few tools, and a few supplies. As we steamed off, they began climbing the bluff to the heavily forested hills above, where they would set to with axe and fire stick to hack out a farm. As if natural hardships weren't enough, these men's efforts were sometimes nullified by the neglect of the department responsible for their rehabilitation. Seed failed to arrive, or perhaps fertilizer or other essentials, man-made setbacks more disastrous than anything nature turned on. Semi-abandoned amid the blackened stumps to which the bush had been reduced, they might have been forgiven for feeling sometimes like members of a forgotten race. More than one gave up hope.
was a trek and a half up to the top of that Kirikiriroa lookout. He said it's about 400 feet up. About 20 years ago it felt really good, but this time round it
On our right appeared a high papa bluff which veered sharply to form a recess in which lurked Tarei Po Kiore, the whirlpool, reputed to be 70 feet deep at normal level. Subdued at this time of low water, it was later to bring me as close to Davy Jones's locker, or its freshwater equivalent, as I could without actually taking the plunge. As on the lower reaches, we still managed to steam progressively north, even though much of our travel was in an easterly or westerly or even southerly direction. A couple of miles beyond Pokiore, the river takes what is probably its most exaggerated deviation, creating a narrow-necked peninsula, something after the shape of a spoon. Opposite its extremity looms one of the most spectacular masses on the river, Man-o-War Bluff, well named for its bulk and shape. With its bow pointing upstream and the water rushing past, a little imagination and poor eyesight might easily have transformed it into a speeding battleship. Here the downrush of water through the years had scoured a large pocket in the bluff, from which the current was deflected at right angles, forming an L-shaped pattern around the shingle bank at the tip of the peninsula. In an idle moment I happened to be leaning through the engine room side shutter as we approached the bluff, prior to making the right-hand turn round the shingle bank. That was my thinking anyway, but my ideas on river navigation proved to be still a little naive. With this done, we completed our haul, re-embarked our passengers, and fought on up to Whakahoro, where shallow water finally defeated us. The settlers in the area during this time were forced to pack supplies in through the bush from Raurimu by horse. I suppose that with some effort I could go on recalling incidents to do with the boats, the river, and the people connected with them. Certainly there are many more to be told. But perhaps what I have recalled will help in giving a clearer picture of the meaning of that vague term, Whanganui Riverboats, and in retarding its descent to the realm of things been, gone, and forgotten. I left the river in 1919.
We're actually still farming 1,400 acres out there, and so we've got the last farmland out in those farms, which is the better part of about 6 of the return servicemen farms after World War I. And there was about 16 farms in that greater Kaipakuka Valley, and then 30 farms in the Mangapurua.
The old road down to the riverboat landing.
No bulldozers.
No, put it all by hand.
Far out.
Quite a bit of grass over on the side.
Yeah. Yeah. There's always a good mob of deer over there and a few goats and a little potty in.
And so when you see the history here around Whakahoro, this old post office and the old school, the riverboat landing where you tied up last night, the original homestead, this is kind of all the same history as the Bridge to Nowhere history. This is just the northern end of the valleys, and you know, the riverboats used to stop here and down at the Mangapuru landing.
Yeah. It's about the same size, isn't it? Roughly, yeah. Probably about 18 kilometres long. Quite long.
So we've got a hell of a long way to get your stock in and out.
Yeah, you had. Park Little all good. Right, shut up. Pretty big old structure, eh? Yeah. So I'll use some of the old timbers and, like I said, you know, a bit of mind yourselves here. Maggie's been working on it for a couple of weeks while I'm away. Got to get onto it.
She is, holy moly. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it is. That's the depot.
Oh, it's the depot.
That's the only real true remaining building of the whole Bridge to Nowhere era right there.
Wow.
All original, lines original, everything.
So we're opening up some of the old roads and got some bush huts out there and things like the old post office. We're doing up all those old huts, trying to turn the whole place into a big working museum, essentially looking after the history and allowing people to get out and share it, explore it.
Oh, yeah. The old road is very, very neat. Now this was the old road, but instead of going up the hill, of course, because they couldn't go up in hills in those days, they had to keep around the other side of the valley from us here.
Oh, yeah.
And so, I've done up the track, and but she's a pretty rugged walking track. You got to know what you're doing a bit. And I've done it up for a few kilometres, and it links back out into my farm again. Then it goes through my farmland for a few kilometres out here, and then it heads into the bush, and it goes for about 25 kilometres, and links back into the middle of the Mangapuru Valley.
I don't like the thought of farming degrading the environment. I don't like the thought of tourism degrading the environment. You know, it's counterproductive to try and be a tourism and have bloody rubbish everywhere. If tourists are coming in, dropping bags of rubbish on the sides of the road, for example. So I want tourism to be about improving the environment. And farming, it's a difficult one with farming, but I want farming to be quite sustainable and to be able to, you know, try and look after things as well. So through tourism, we're getting people to help us set a lot of stoat traps and try to keep the rats and the stoats under control. We've still got a lot of blue ducks on the small tributaries of the Whanganui River and Recollections rivers. In this Whakapai, we'd have an average of about 6 pairs of blue ducks just around the corner here. And so we're really trying to promote the environment for them by killing the stoats, killing the cats, killing the rats, and we want the Fio to be there forever. So we've got good populations of kiwis here. One of the boys just heard a kiwi just behind the cafe last week, coming down the hill and calling right behind the cafe here, which is nice. So we're hoping that in 10 years' time, when you come and stay in one of the lodges, you'll be tripping over kiwis trying to get to your front door. Because they've been dying out. They were dying out at about 10% per year. And it doesn't take too much of a mathematician to work out that if they're dying out by 10% per year, it's not very long and you've got no kiwis left in the wild. But yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
Station.
That was really good.
No problem.
Canoes, rafts and jet boats notwithstanding, there can be no equal to the experience of shooting a long, twisting rapid in a lumbering, flat-bottomed, inelegant workhorse that was a Whanganui Riverboat in its heyday. The days of which I write are gone forever, superseded by more modern transport methods. The boats have gone and the men have gone, all but a lingering few like the Wairua and me. Nor would it again be feasible to run a vessel of any size in wake of the old upriver fleet. Except over the few rapidless miles of the lower reaches, the cost of maintaining a navigable channel through the ever-flooding, ever-changing riverbed would be prohibitive. I'm on the high side of 70 now, and as the years flow by, I feel an increasing regret that such an important part of New Zealand's history has not been comprehensively recorded. Search the nation's bookshelves for a book on the Whanganui Riverboats, and you'll search in vain. It saddens me to find that today, with the coal smoke barely settled, and the calls of the Maori crews still perhaps finally echoing from the cliffs, so few people realise what a colourful and unique era it was. I feel it must be written more fully into the country's rugged past, and soon, before those of us left, remnants of a truly dying breed, move on with our little bits of personal experience and first-hand knowledge that make such a story real. But if I'm to see this, it seems, there will have to be an element of do-it-yourself about it. The little bits of personal experience will have to be my own. The aim here is not to write the story of the riverboats. There's no thought of its being the be-all and end-all of the story, nor would it be a purely historical record of facts and figures. It'll simply be one man's view of the times as he lived and saw them during a particular period, with perhaps a few facts thrown in. Moving swiftly between the willows, I closed my eyes and seemed to hear the splashing of paddles, the churning of rapids, the shouts of Maori deckhands to their friends on the banks. A feeling of kinship with the old Wairua pervaded me, and in spite of the gaiety aboard, I felt it was a lonely voyage for us both. As we swung our bows upstream and drew in towards our berth, I saw a notice attached to the old Hatrick wharves. Danger, sunken wrecks. No, it wasn't just a trip on a boat. It was a sentimental journey indeed.